Hey everybody, I hope you're all staying healthy and safe. If you're looking for a small break from the chaos or a little entertainment while you're social distancing, let's take a look at how to make some sourdough bread. Alright, first things first, we have to feed our starter. There's a lot of mystery and misconceptions about starters, but it's basically just a naturally cultivated strain of yeast that we can use to leaven our bread. I posted a link below to a really straightforward method on how to do it by a baker named Patrick Ryan from Firehouse Bakery. Basically, we're just adding equal parts by weight whole wheat flour and water once per day, or once per week if it's in the fridge. The night before we mix the dough, we'll feed it one last time to refresh it. Now it's time to make our levain. This is just a way to convert part of your starter into a mixture we can throw into the dough all at once without worrying about using up all of your starter in the first place. In a small bowl, mix together 35 grams or 1/4 cup of our refreshed starter, 35 grams or 1/4 cup each of whole wheat and bread flour, and 70 grams or 3/4 of a cup of water. Mix until well combined and let this sit for 5 full hours. If that feels like a long time, this whole process takes about 3 full days, so you better buckle up. 4 hours after mixing our levain, we'll combine our flour and water to start our dough. For this recipe, you'll need a total of 900 grams or 7 full cups of bread flour. In the biggest bowl you can find, combine 700 grams or 5 1/2 cups of bread flour, 100 grams or 3/4 of a cup of rye flour, and 100 grams or 3/4 of a cup of whole wheat flour. Mix until well combined, and then add 600 grams or 2 3/4 cup of water. We're not looking to knead the dough at this point, just mix it until there isn't any more dry flour on the sides of the bowl. We're just looking to hydrate all of the flour completely, and then we'll let this sit on the counter for about 1 hour. This step where we let the flour hydrate is called an autolyse, and it's really important for the development of gluten as well as flavor within the resultant bread. Things get really interesting. After one painstaking hour has passed, add your levain into the dough. Keep a small glass of water nearby. We'll be using that kind of throughout the whole process. So pick your favorite Ninja Turtle. Mine is personally Leonardo. Use 3 fingers like a Ninja Turtle hand to pinch the starter into the hydrated flour until it becomes one giant wet and sticky mass. Once everything's relatively well combined, we're going to use something called the rhubarb method to develop a little more gluten in our dough. During this method, we're going to tip the bowl forward and repetitively scoop the dough up and down, just kind of letting it fall back down against the side of the bowl. It's kind of like the motion where you're trying to hurry somebody along. We're just kind of repetitively scooping up and letting it fall down, scooping up, letting it fall down. This helps incorporate the starter even more and helps smooth out our dough so it's a little easier to handle down the line. Once this step is done, we're going to let that guy sit on the counter for 20 more minutes to let the gluten relax a little bit and continue to let everything incorporate together. Okay, here's where things get a little bit dicey. It's time to add our salt. This next step is going to look like an absolute friggin' mess, but I promise it's going to turn out well. Mix 18 grams or 1 tablespoon of kosher salt into about 1/4 cup of water. Once that's well combined, splash that over your dough. Using the same Ninja Turtle pinching method, just keep squishing the salt into the dough over and over. Squishing that salt into the dough. Water is going to do 2 major things to our dough. Firstly, it's initially going to draw some water out of the dough due to the higher salinity outside of the dough itself. As you incorporate and use that Ninja Turtle hand repetitively, this water will get absorbed back in. Don't freak out, don't panic just yet. Things are gonna turn out fine. Secondly, the higher salinity within the dough will make our developed strands of gluten contract and make this gooey mixture look more like, well, bread dough. Once there isn't any more water in your bowl, dump everything onto the countertop, and we're gonna start something called slap and fold. So this dough looks kind of like an abomination at this point, but watch how cool this next part is. And honestly, I've never done this next part before, so this is genuinely the first time I'm experiencing it. Just go right to the audio from the video and you can kind of see how my first reaction was to this.
Dude, come on. That works so friggin' well. Oh my god, dude, are you kidding me? Look at this thing. Pick it up from the sides, drop the bottom of it, throw it over. Pick it up, turn, drop the bottom, throw it over.
After about 3 to 5 minutes of that slap and fold technique, we need to let our dough rest for one more 15-minute period. This is going to allow the gluten strands within the dough itself to relax, and will also allow that natural fermentation to take place that'll add air to the dough and help leaven the bread down the line. In a fresh, clean bowl, place all of the dough at the bottom of the bowl and gently cover it. Let this sit on the counter for about 15 minutes. The next step in this process is called stretch and fold, and it's another technique that we can use to develop these long strands of gluten within our dough. Dip your hand into a little bit of water, then pinch the dough around the outsides of the bowl. Give it one long stretch up without breaking it, and then drop it over the center of the dough. Do this about 6 or 7 times until you've made it all the way around the bowl itself. We're going to perform this step 4 times total, with 15 minutes in between each set of stretch and folds. At the very end, your dough should be pleasantly jiggly, and that'll just let us know that there's enough air within the dough itself that it'll rise well once it gets in the oven. To help create the final shape of the bread as we let it rest overnight, we're going to use a bread proofing basket, something called a banneton. In order to make sure that our dough doesn't stick to the walls of the banneton itself, we're going to heavily dust the inside with rice flour or all-purpose flour if that's all you have. Really be pretty liberal with this. It's going to rest about 12 hours overnight, and we need to make sure that once we turn this dough out into our Dutch oven, that nothing is sticking and that we get a very solid and kind of smooth edge on the outside of our dough. Okay, we've done enough poking and prodding. It's time to make this actually look like a loaf of bread. If you've made it this far, that's kind of what we're going for, right? Dump this whole operation onto a clean countertop and divide the dough in half using a bench scraper or a sharp knife gently dusted with flour. It's helpful if you kind of draw a line across the diameter of the dough using some flour to make sure that nothing sticks. It doesn't have to be exact. You can weigh it if you want to, but a reasonable guesstimate does just fine. Using your bench scraper, gather each one of these blobs into just a small round circle, and we're going to let it rest for just about 10 more minutes for our final bench rest. Okay, here comes a really cool part. The goal of this is to put some final tension in the outside of our dough so that it can get really solid and crusty when it bakes. Think of it like putting the tension rods in a tent right before the whole operation rises off the ground. Lightly flour the top side of the bread, and then with some confidence, just flip it right over so the side that's facing up is still a little sticky and a little tacky. With the dough lying flat, fold the bottom half up towards the center of the bread and just give it a light pressure down to make sure that that seam seals. Do the same thing with each side, making sure that you're folding the sides over one another and it's creating kind of a tight package as we move along. The last part of this is to take the top part of the bread and fold it down over itself and rolling it down towards yourself as you push the bottom forward and seal the seam that's on the bottom of the bread. Let that sealed package rest on the bench for about 2 or 3 minutes just to make sure that that seam confidently seals and that it won't come apart as it rests overnight in the fridge. You're sure that the seam on your dough is sealed, we're going to flip it over so the seam side is actually facing up, and then we're going to place the smooth surface, that's the top of our bread, down into the bottom of the banneton. Again, that's seam side facing up. We'll dust the top of this with a little bit more flour and then gently cover with either a kitchen towel or a little cling wrap if you have it. We'll let this sit in the refrigerator overnight or about 12 hours, and we'll wake up early tomorrow morning and finally bake some bread. Okay, we're coming on day 3 of this whole process, so let's finally make some bread. Wake up at some ungodly hour of the morning, place your Dutch oven inside your oven, and preheat the oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Take one of the bannetons out of the fridge, turn the dough out onto a sheet of parchment paper that'll fit inside the base of your Dutch oven. Now it's time to score our bread. We're going to be using something called a lame. That's a French word for blade. It's spelled L-A-M-E, like lame. It's just a really sharp blade that we're going to use to cut the top of the bread that'll control some of the expansion. That way we can kind of account for some of the rise and make it the shape that we want to once it's actually a baked loaf of bread. You can use pretty much any knife for this process. A serrated knife works well, but if it is just a straight chef's knife, make sure it's the sharpest knife that you have. Holding the blade at about a 45-degree angle to the top of the surface of the dough, make about a half-inch score all the way down in a straight line across the top of the dough. After scoring the dough, place the whole thing in your Dutch oven and place that guy in the oven for 20 minutes at 500 degrees. Then you'll take off the lid, drop the temperature down to 450 degrees, and continue to bake until golden brown and crusty on the top, about 30 more minutes. After 3 days worth of mixing, folding, slapping, ninja turtling, scoring, and finally baking, out of the oven comes probably some of the best looking bread I've ever made.
Fucking science, man. Science!